So thanks everyone for coming. This talk is a story of something I did um, about 18 months ago now. It was a while ago, but it was a very good learning activity about what it means to do red teaming and security in a really cloud native fashion and how different that is to kind of the more traditional ways of doing security and doing red teaming. Um, we'll start off with what I found anecdotally is the main thing that people remember from this talk, um, which is a wonderful word called sujigiri, or pronounced probably far better by many people. And what it means is something quite amazing. It's like it's obviously a Japanese word. It's like one of those German words that is just so succinctly summarizes something. And what it means is trying out a new samurai sword on a random passerby. Now you'll see why I talk about this word in respect to red teaming, because it's very much this kind of spirit, which is how we approached the day. Um, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself, which I apologize for. Who am I? I'm Josh Armitage. I'm a principal consultant at Contino. And why you should listen to me about security is I lived in a prison colony for 13 years. Um, but most of you would know that as Australia. So please don't hold that against me too much. So one of the things I always like to focus on and Contino as a company focus on is shift left learning. We talk about shift left in so many different contexts. It's almost becoming a meme in and of itself nowadays. But it's very much the case of how do we bring learning forward earlier and have it so you don't have everyone learning why security is important when it's too late. I mean, this kind of graph of cost versus time is used again in many different contexts. But the idea is that with security breaches, and the longer it takes to find out about it, or the longer it takes to fix a hole, can get very expensive. I mean, we've seen with GDPR and that kind of stuff that the fines for having a breach have just got huge. Never mind the reputational damage, the loss of revenue. Like security is important. It really should be job zero to take AWS parlance. Um, but it really should be something fundamental. But it's something that's very hard to make fundamental. And what red teaming and this particular style allows you is really force that to be a fundamental part of the culture and the way people approach things. Um, a way I like to think about things is to split out knowledge into kind of these three separate buckets. You have your known knowns, which are the things you know you know. You've got your known unknowns, which are the things you know you don't know. And then you've got your unknown unknowns, which are the more esoteric, difficult to discover things. Like it's easy to know when you don't know something, but if you don't know something, how do you actually find that out? Um, so let's just cover off known knowns. Security is everyone's responsibility. I doubt anyone is going to argue with me on that point. Definitely no one from a security role is going to argue with me on that point, but it's something that, I think most people will agree on, but it's always important to make sure everyone does agree. Um, every company will have an incident response process normally written down somewhere. In this case, the company I'm talking about today, they did have one written down that, you know, generally you join a company, they'll give you, this is the incident response in case something goes awfully wrong. Read it, sign off that you've read it. They may make you sign off every 6 months. How much of an impact that really has on day to day, I would argue not very much generally, which is unfortunate, but is just the nature of the beast. Um, in this case, the company I was working for were generally one that was split quite remote. There was a central office, but generally the staff were dispersed across the entire metropolitan area. For this red teaming scenario, we actually made it so everyone was in the same place. I think especially in 2020 with COVID, we're all very aware of the strain that being remote puts on communication, especially in high pressure scenarios where you need that high bandwidth. And we felt that if we made everyone operate in a remote fashion, it was going to make a lot of things more difficult. And it wasn't the thing we wanted to test in this case. Like a lot of things with red teaming is it's not something you do once. It's something you do iteratively, and you change the parameters so you can see what effect things have. Like taking a very scientific method is you want to change one variable, not all variables. And if you can control certain things and only have that one variable, it allows you to test things much better. Other things in the known knowns bucket was kind of the expected avenues. So when we went to red team, and this was a red team very specifically attacking the like cloud service provider angle itself. So it was, what could we get away with within AWS? A lot of red teaming focused on, well, if I hit your external endpoint and start using script kiddie attacks or SQL injection or whatever you want, that you can get access to boxes and that kind of stuff. What really happens when you move to the cloud is you have this other angle to things, which is you've enabled all your developers to do magical, wonderful stuff, and it's very much worthwhile. I don't want people to take away from this webinar that you need to control what your devs are doing a lot more because it's scary. That's not really the message I'm trying to push. And I think with the expected avenues, I had ideas of what people were going to try and do to defend themselves, what they were going to look for. I was working with people I'd worked with for a good couple of years at that point, so I had ideas about how they were going to try and defend themselves. And me being the person I am, I could then try and get out one step in front and go, okay, well, how am I going to stop them from being able to do the things I'm expecting them to do? And make it harder and make them really kind of struggle. Very much samurai sword and the passerby. If they know it's coming, it's not as good. So from there, we'll move on to the known unknowns. So, like, how do we measure performance in this? Very much a disciple of, what gets measured gets managed. If you can't measure it, you can't really manage it. So when you look at something like red teaming from an iterative point of view, how do you prove that you're better than the last time? I don't think having a smaller or less pages to your pen testing report is a good metric, really. When it comes to a lot of things in cloud native, it's normally about speed and time, not quantity. So we took it from the idea of how long to identify that a breach has happened. Like, is it going to be minutes, hours, days? How long until the breach happens or something starts going wrong or weird does it take for people to realize? Time to contain, how long until the breach has been contained and controlled and cannot grow anymore? Obviously very critical in these kind of situations. Percentage of intrusion detected. So once we've got in and me and my partner in crime for the day had our fun, in terms of everything we were able to do, how much could they actually find given a fair amount of time? In this case, it was kind of, if they didn't find it within a few hours, probably they would never find it. They would never think about it. So it's interesting to see in terms of what we could get away with that they wouldn't be able to find given a sufficient amount of time. So on the day in question, the most senior leadership of the company stepped away from this. It was very much an interesting experiment on who would take responsibility if your normal chain of command doesn't exist or is mysteriously absent, as it was on this day. It's very easy if you have certain personalities in the company who take control in these situations, but you don't want to build a dependency on them in terms of like a Phoenix Project Brent kind of style. Every difficult challenge had to funnel through him, and that is something we want to avoid. So with these kind of things, it's one thing to have everyone available as you would expect. It's a very different thing if you start taking away the normal people who have authority and responsibility and seeing what happens more organically within your team. For the company in question, they'd very quickly grown from being 10 people to 30 people. Now, I imagine I'm probably talking to people from enterprises generally on the call, in which case you can take this as a small segment. Like if you have autonomous teams and that kind of stuff, you can look at this from a very like a self-organizing team that has responsibility and accountability should be able to take on these kind of challenges and these kind of environments and workshops, as opposed to looking at like, well, my company is 40,000 people. How do I approach this from that kind of angle? It's more looking at kind of small teams and emboldening them to take responsibility and giving them the understanding. And for the company, in this case, they went from 10 people to 30 people. Generally, a half decent rule of thumb that I've heard parroted and seems to hold fairly true is that processes break around the 3 times scale. So what worked for 5 people will probably really start to creak around 15 people, give or take. So for a lot of the processes that this company had in place around intrusions and security and protection, they scaled to 3 times the size they were when those were minted and written. So this was an excuse and an opportunity to revise those and see what the new form would be based on the change that had happened. And I think it's one of the truisms of business is the only constant is change itself. So a document that was written 12 months or 2 years ago, how valuable is it now? How do you actually manage the life cycle of that and keep it up to date? And this is maybe a slightly more personal one for me, is what lenses do people possess? Now, I've worked in security operations, development, product management, kind of everything around the traps over the last 10 years. What I've generally found is if people have only been a developer in their career, they look at things through a very specific like developer lens, and they will see all their solutions will have kind of a particular bent to them. Same if someone has an operations background or a security background. And what I find is very valuable is if people have had exposure and experience to multiple different kinds of roles, and they can adopt different lenses and be able to see the world through different people's eyes, which I think is really powerful in terms of building a self-organizing team that's truly empowered. And one of the kind of concerns I had at this company is the security lens was few and far between out of the people in the company. Lots of really great developers, lots of really great DevOps people, ways of working, lots of skills in their areas. But when it came to security, they were lacking the ability to look at the problem the right way to see what the solution would be. And I think we all know what happens when you give when developers can be given free reign, and if you were to go and look at IAM policies, so you'd end up with lots of admin permissions floating around, because to their goals, it helps them achieve their goals of moving faster, because that's what they're being tracked against and marked against. So it's interesting when you come to lenses, is how can you give people different lenses to be able to look at things in different ways and reach better outcomes. So now we come to the unknown unknowns. Now, by their very definition, we couldn't have known what they were up front. Otherwise, they'd be known unknowns, right? Makes sense. But generally, when we talk about unknowns and kinds of building distributed systems, there's a very common way now of approaching that kind of problem and trying to find unknown unknowns. So people are more than likely familiar with Netflix, Chaos Monkey. I mean, Gremlin Inc. is a company based around introducing chaos into systems to see what happens. So that's very much a way of trying to unearth unknown unknowns in your system, is by injecting chaos in there, or if you want, hitting a random passerby with a samurai sword. So for us, the blue team on this day had no idea they were going to be a blue team that day. They were invited to all come into the office under false pretense. We're going to work on other projects. And the idea was to really inject chaos and see what happened if all of a sudden a security incident broke out. So it's one thing to do an experiment when people are prepared. It's another thing entirely to do it to them unprepared and not let them understand what's going to happen and actually see a much more organic response and much more realistic response than what would happen if, oh, there's going to be a red team event or pen testing done next week. Okay, cool. Now I know that that's going to happen. If I see things, I'm going to react differently, less stress. It's not as realistic as hey, surprise, security incident, let's go. Another thing that we did that are very important in these kind of scenarios are rules of engagement. For example, I wasn't allowed to go and completely break identity and access management and block anyone else from getting in, because that would kind of defeat the learning process of this if we just stored them at the gates and went, no, you can't get in. We were given a limit on AWS spend for the day. We couldn't spend more than £500. £500 does actually get you a fair way in AWS, but we were told we weren't allowed to go and just start Bitcoin mining on the biggest instances we could get and have that as the security breach. On top of that, those are the main two, but effectively was don't allow the blue team to win or have a chance, and don't go and spend all the money in the world. You know, sensible stuff, but you know, if you're finding people to be on your red team, sometimes they could get very, and admittedly I was as well. I was like, I'm sure I'm not allowed to do this, but I should probably better ask in terms of what I could do to IAM and what I was allowed to do in order to kind of give the potential for the blue team to actually counteract and respond. So from there, we'll move into the actual day and a kind of a play-by-play of the day as it happened. Necessary meme in a talk, otherwise I feel I've let everyone down. Appreciate if you don't like it, but it's just the way I am. So 10 o'clock in the morning. So give people enough time to have caffeine before you do this. Otherwise, that's particularly cruel. So we started. So prior to this, in the couple of weeks beforehand, we'd set up a few bits and pieces. We'd set up secondary IAM keys on people. We'd set up a few bits and pieces we're planning on using to do this, just so we had enough of a basis there to be able to launch a variety of pre-planned attacks. We'd spent some time building out a CLI to go and do a variety of things. So like, obviously you would expect in this case, going back to kind of that expected avenues point, is if a breach happens in AWS, I'll go look at CloudTrail to see what's going on. We built a CLI tool that would effectively call so many API calls that CloudTrail would end up becoming almost useless, or would become so much noise versus the signal that it wouldn't just allow them to track us down instantly, but made it all that much harder. So initial salvo, we started doing a couple of things. Nothing too untoward. One of the critical parts to what we did here was very much a process to channel learning. Now, in a crisis, generally the senior people will stand up, take over control, and the more junior people will watch from the sidelines. That was something we wanted to make sure didn't happen in this case. So it was very important for us that the junior people on the team be the people who actually have to drive, hit the buttons, hit the keyboard, drive that process going forward. So, you know, it's one of the core tenets around like pair programming is the more senior person should be touching the keyboard far less than the more junior person. So that was kind of a key tenet we had, was let's make the newest people to the company, the most junior, the ones that are actually doing the hard yards, and make the senior people stand back and force them to channel their approach through other people. So 3 minutes after we started doing some things, with the nature of the company being cloud native, there was a automatic trigger we knew would fire if someone created an EC2 machine in any AWS account. It would trigger an alert in Slack. So we wanted people to find out that we were doing things or things were going on. Obviously, we could have gone and done, knowing the company, we could have gone and done all manner of things before anyone knew what we were doing. But again, that would kind of defeat the point. It isn't the point of having the red team like win and show how bad everything is. It's about shifting left that learning and getting it so people can learn. So we created an EC2 machine knowing that that would actually trigger an alert that should start people looking. Also, at the same time, again, if you look at what kind of professional red teams and pen testers do, is they build up this thing called open source intelligence, where they will lay low, they will figure out everything they can about the context to be able to do the most damage or have the highest chance of success. In this case, we knew the tooling that was in place at the company, so we built a phish email that used all the same styling as the tooling to see how many people would fall for it. Now, bearing in mind this was a company of mostly devs, that you would expect that a phish, you would hope that a phish wouldn't be that successful. We still got a few people with this. So it just shows, often with phishing, they're like, oh, it's the other person in the company that's the issue. Like, everyone can be an issue when it comes to phishing. Someone's just a little bit too optimistic about the email or is feeling under pressure, things can happen. So then 6 minutes later, someone smells smoke. So nine minutes after we started doing things, 6 minutes after we triggered the known tripwire, someone actually started calling out on Slack that, hey, look, I think something's going on, which is pretty good. Ironically, the person that discovered it was one of the more senior people. His IAM access had already been shut off at that point. A minute later, he gets someone who's like, oh yeah, oh, okay, I'll come and have a look at this with you. Naturally, we cut off her IAM at Denise the instant she offered to help as well. You might wonder how we knew all this was going on, and how we had, like, we weren't sitting there in the same room or in the same office doing the attack, because it would have been very obvious why are they all sitting in a corner looking at a laptop together while all this stuff is going on. So we'd actually moved to an adjacent building. But what we had done is we had left someone in the office who knew what was going on to feed us back information, so we could stay one step ahead of what they were doing and use that intelligence to help make better decisions, and also pull back if we're getting too far ahead, and make it so there was a good to and fro there, as opposed to, we're just going ahead with no idea what's going on. Again, so 3 minutes after 3 minutes after that was discovered that something was going on and people were investigating it, an announcement went out on Slack saying that, hey, this is not a drill. Okay, everyone needs to down tools, stop working on whatever you're working on. There is something actively happening. So everyone needs to actually mob on this, and let's get this sorted and under control. So from 12 minutes from us starting, from 9 minutes from the initial trigger, the incident was fully in progress. People were following it and doing what they wanted. 5 minutes later, the CEO got a call. Now, I was sitting across the table for him. I saw him look at his phone, smirk, and put it back down. He was one of the instigators of the whole idea of this. And, he knew that he was going to get a call, because it just so happened calling him was step one on the incident response plan that we had. So from the initial trigger, 14 minutes after we knew that someone would be knowing what we were doing, they found the Confluence stock with the response process and actually called out, which was good. He refused to pick up. Now, I already spoke a little bit about the fact that the most senior people in the company were not there. And it was very much an idea of trying to see what organic structure would develop within the team if the normal structure was kind of taken away to a large degree. And it's interesting to see what happens in these scenarios. So what happened was this. There was one person at the top who was the person who initially discovered there's an intrusion happening and called the incident, the fact that an incident was happening, that it wasn't a drill. And underneath him, he had an array of people all reporting into him. Now, I think it can be people can probably assume what happens. I mean, bearing in mind there was not 8 people, there was about 20 people all feeding back into this one person. So naturally, that happened. It is not possible for one person to manage this, take on input from 20 different people, manage what people were doing, keep that kind of holistic view over everything. That is just not tenable. However, would be quite common to see this as the initial organic structure that forms. So, but you wouldn't do it again if it came to it. So at 10:28, they called for stop and regroup. So Paul, who is the guy at kind of the top, acting as kind of the leader in the situation, he said, actually, we just need to stop. Like, can people just stop doing what they're doing? Let's get it all under control. Very much a case of lots of haste, but not much progress being made. Like, everyone was working really hard and trying to do the right thing, but there was no coherent strategy. It was very much a case of they had all speed but no velocity. Like, the direction was completely wrong, or they were directionless. So it's very much a point of get everyone back together. Let's actually figure out what's going on. So 10:30, they did an access poll. So as I said before, we'd gone through culling off senior people's AWS access. So then then they needed to figure out who actually had access. So in this case, it was going to end up being the more junior members of staff. But at least now, once they figured this out, they could then go through and figure out how many different streams of work, how they could proportion work, how they could actually respond properly. The interesting part we found was that people were claiming to not have access that still did, which either showed they never used their access or didn't know how to do it, or they weren't willing to take responsibility, which was an interesting thing. I didn't expect that to happen, but again, it's one of those unknown unknowns that comes through as part of this. You're like, well, okay, but it was something to take back with the people that were like that. Okay, why was it an honest mistake, or didn't you feel comfortable? Like, it's those kind of interesting scenarios that can help you learn things about people and learn how they feel and how comfortable they are. So 7 minutes after that, they split into a comms role and a leader role. So instead of that kind of organic structure with one head, they had one person taking very much a leadership role in terms of figuring out what the strategy was, and they had a comms role whose sole responsibility was to funnel all the information coming back in and filter it for the pertinent stuff to pass to the leader for them to be able to make those decisions. I mean, there are probably corollaries in like having line managers and team leaders and those kind of things, but splitting the responsibilities up allow them to actually function. Now, I mentioned the fly on the wall previously. He wasn't being very helpful in the discussions. Like, he was feigning ignorance and stuff like that. Him being one of the more senior people in the company, that got awfully suspicious, and they kicked him out. They realized that he was on the side of the red team, and they kicked him out of the room. So around this point, a couple of minutes before this, we had actually let the team know that this was an experiment, a challenge, but it was being conducted by the people that they had already somewhat guessed were suspiciously absent from the office at that point in time. So what we felt was important, that we didn't let the stress levels get too high. We got them the shock with the fact they didn't know what was going on, but we didn't want them to have to kind of persist under the adrenaline of being constantly scared of what was going to happen going forward. So we did let them know that it was us, and that, but at the same time, treat it as if it was real, and you're now on the clock to beat what was me and one other guy against 20 people. Could they beat us with that head start that we had? 7 minutes after that, so there's an AWS based attack. I just so happened to find someone's GitHub OAuth token sitting in parameter store, unencrypted. Absolutely wonderful. I then started to take that and started to create a bunch of repositories under their GitHub user to see, this is kind of one of the core things at AWS is any credentials in there, you have to be able to manage those and protect those in the right way. What was interesting is the guy who'd done this didn't know he'd done the wrong thing. Like, it wasn't an intentional, like, oh, I'll just stick it in there and be fine. He's like, well, okay, fair enough. It should have been better. What should I have done? And it really came down to something like, I think a lot of developers in AWS, and you can take your GCP, Azure, Alibaba equivalent here. of one of the core components of AWS that, from a developer point of view, you either live with and hate, or you just kind of avoid it. And that's KMS, like the key management service. Like a lot of times when you're talking about security on AWS, you talk about, or from a developer point of view, it's all IAM, IAM, IAM. Not saying that IAM is not important, but one of the equally important things is a proper understanding of KMS. Because KMS is how I can protect within an account access to something. So, taking this GitHub credential in parameter store, it should have been locked down with a KMS key that stopped me from being able to access it, and only the person that put it there could have accessed it. Or maybe just no read at all and only put, because why would I need to read it back? So I think it's just one of those things that often developers don't really get to grips with, is KMS, because again, it's somewhat orthogonal to their process of getting stuff out as fast as possible. But it's one of those core systems that if you can invest in training, invest in getting people across, really pays dividends and allows them to use AWS in a way that is truly secure, and helps protect from, it's that defense in depth against IAM as well. Like, yeah, okay, I have S3 read to everything, but if you lock down with KMS, you can still give me S3 read, but know that your things are going to be protected as well. So, a couple of minutes after that, all silent on the Western Front. So once they kicked Fly on the Wall out the room, once they knew that it was friendlies actually perpetrating the red team attack, they realized we should probably stop using Slack, seeing as we know they can see that. So we lost all communication. I think they moved, from memory, they moved to Google Hangouts, but they only invited the people that were in the room onto there. So we lost all visibility into what they were doing. So that was not great from our perspective, because we still wanted to see what was going on. So 4 minutes after that, we sent in reinforcements. So we sent the CTO and one of the other directors back in to help kind of re-energize the people in the room, to help take some level of control back, and also to give us another communication channel back in so we could understand what they were doing. So we wanted to be able to, allow them to feel like they were succeeding, and also to just help boost morale when it was maybe dropping off a little bit. I mean, everyone had a really fun time on the day, but while everything was kind of out of control, and we, as the red team, we were able to do whatever we want, and they weren't managing to kind of track down on us too well, that we did give them some hints by injecting people who knew what had happened back into the team in the room. 3 minutes after that, there was a false contain. So we heard from the CTO that, hey, they think they've got you contained. Have they? To which we went, nope, they have not. Which was always interesting. They thought it was over. They were very much wrong. 18 minutes later, they realized it wasn't over. We started getting a little bit more brash in what we were doing, making it very obvious that we still had access to certain things. I think I created IAM roles like "you haven't got me yet," and things like that. We're having some amount of fun with it. And I think it's one of the things with red team activities is they should still be fun. Like if these turn into situations that aren't fun, I think you lose a lot of kind of the magic and the learning and everything else that happens. That everyone should come out of this with a smile on their face. Maybe a little bit of stress, maybe a little bit of hair loss, but generally people should be finding these fun and entertaining, because then that really helps it become a self-propelling mechanism that makes people want to do it again and to think of new things. And I'll kind of come to those kind of long tail effects in a bit. 5 minutes later, the two of us who've been perpetrating the red team attack decided to start gloating a little bit on Slack, and we were sending people messages and having a bit of a laugh about it. We were having fun with it as well, and we got some choice words back from people, but we were having some fun with it, and it was starting to wind down. So as you can see, like 8 minutes later, they had actually managed to contain us. So they'd managed to revoke all our access. We couldn't get anywhere else. So, after an hour and a half, we were fully contained. And at 10 to 12, we walked back into the room. There was a variety of hand gestures, looks, again, choice words, sent at us, all in good fun. But in terms of, people weren't particularly appreciative. We'd gone and caused them that much stress over a 2-hour bit. But from there, it went from containment to remediation. So very much, we were contained. We couldn't do anything more. How long would it take people to undo everything we'd done? So all in all, in 2 hours, all the stress had kind of gone, and we moved on to the second phase. We did have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. If we weren't contained by 1 o'clock, we were going to stop nonetheless, and then move to remediation. Again, it's kind of those setting those boundaries and constraints so you can make sure you leave time for everything you want to get out of the day. Like, we could have run on into the distance. Like with the red team, we did slow down to allow them to catch up, but that was kind of the point. We weren't there to make them spend the entire day chasing us around. It was about to really give them a realistic scenario, run the experiment, and then also give them time for everything we wanted to get out of it, which, in this case was, can they find everything we did, which is, important. So now we kind of move on to the third part of the webinar, which is the notion of Kaizen. It's continuous improvement, change for good, comes out of Lean, Toyota Production System, all that wonderful stuff. And I'm very much a Lean advocate. And I think continuous improvement is something that, by its very name, is continuous. Like, how do you constantly improve? Not have a meeting to decide how you're going to improve, but how do you actually make this improvement happen organically and over time? So we set some metrics earlier on. So time to identify, 12 minutes. Good or bad? I think that's pretty good. But it's more about having the measure. So when we do it, when we're to do it again, we have something to measure against. Like, from this, we'll come up with a bunch of actions that we think will make it better next time. But how do we actually prove that? And that's really where the improvement comes in, is how do we measure it and how do we show we've improved it? Time to contain, 1 hour and 28 minutes. Again, not really sure whether it's good or bad. To a degree, I don't really care. In some way, what I care about is the fact that doing it again, we would improve, and that we're going to take actions to improve that. Percentage of intrusion detected. So we've been keeping a Slack channel of everything we've done, every resource we've created, everything we've done in AWS, we kept a running Slack channel, private one, for the red team, so then we wouldn't forget anything that we'd done. And then we were able to cross-reference that, given, I think we gave them about 3-4 hours to go and try and uncover everything we'd done. And then we marked it against, we've done this, did you find it? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. They found 66%, so about 2/3. Again, it's hard to say whether that's good or bad. I think that's probably half decent. But again, it gives us that point to improve on in the future. One of the interesting things the questions I got when we came back into the room was people querying the realism of the scenario. And for me, I found that interesting because I thought what we'd done, we based it on something that was realistic. We did things that we thought was very, very realistic for people to do, yet people, again, kind of coming back to that concept of lenses, that without that security lens, they were querying, oh, but this wouldn't really happen, right? Based on the kind of scenario we ran, it could be a disgruntled employee, it could be someone's credentials got hijacked with their MFA. There were very realistic kind of origin scenarios for the attack that happened. So I think it was really interesting to just kind of show people what it could look like and kind of give them a new mental model for looking at how security incidents can happen and what they need to be wary about as well. This is database, general database parlance, but I think it applies here. Like, backups never fail, restores do. Like, it's not until you actually, like, you can have a wonderful incident response process written down, You can run training, you can do all this kind of stuff, but until you make it real, you don't know what's going to happen. Like there's the adage of, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're not. So it's very much putting those stress tests on your processes and the understanding and making sure that people properly do understand the realities of what can go on and what they need to be doing. So, I mean, nearly every security talk has the OODA loop in there, but I really like it, so I'm going to do it again. So the OODA loop was the invention of a Air Force lieutenant, I believe, query on the lieutenant bit, called John Boyd, otherwise known as 42nd Boyd. And the idea was that in a simulator, he would defeat every other pilot in a dogfight within 40 seconds. Now, when you get someone that's as exceptional as that and able to do that kind of thing, the natural inclination is to go, well, how do you do this? And the way he had it was he had what was called the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. And the idea is that this is a loop you can go through, and that if you're able to go through this loop faster than your opponent, then you'll be able to outmaneuver them, because you'll be able to get within their actions and be able to counteract their actions as they're making them. So the bit where I think this really ties in is what it turned out that the blue team were missing mostly was observability, just understanding what's going on. Like the time it took them to observe what had happened in the AWS accounts was so long that they really had no chance of catching us up. Like they really had there wasn't like tooling to kind of scan cross region. We did have some tooling in place, but it wasn't sufficient for you to ask kind of new arbitrary questions. Very much kind of like that definition of observability, being able to ask, given inputs and outputs, being able to ask new questions of the system. If you look at Honeycomb or listen to Charlie Major speak at all, talks about this a lot. But it's very much being able to take the information, be able to condense it down to something that's meaningful and actionable. And in this case, they just couldn't get that information quick enough. So it made it very hard for them to be able to really counteract this in any meaningful way. Which, yeah, was generally just a lack of tooling. I just so happen to have a bunch of Jupyter notebooks for scraping like AWS APIs across many accounts quickly. Me being the bad team member I was, they weren't committed back anywhere that anyone else could access. We had lots of little bespoke tools sitting on random laptops that we'd written for a particular problem and all that kind of stuff, but really kind of bringing it all back together and having like a consistent tooling set which allows you to react and observe in these scenarios wasn't there. So it pointed out a distinct lack on our side. As I said, it was really important for us to kind of capture improvements. So as I think everyone is aware, the way you capture improvements and things you want to do is make them Jira tickets. We did end up with a giant backlog from this of security tasks that were just assigned and prioritized as and when we could. It's not always the sexiest or the highest or the perceived highest priority thing to work on these security tasks, but they do need to be done and they do need to be managed and done in that way. The other parts of one of the real benefits we got out of this that wasn't expected was it was the beginning of a tradition. So from the red team activity, it spawned an internal CTF that was run. It spawned running CTF at a conference. It spawned a lot more conversations and thoughts and thought leadership around security within the company. And it's something that is still talked about and still helps drive people to be better all this time later. Like the people who went through that process have written better IAM, they've used KMS, they've been better security citizens ever since that day. And I think that's the real power and value of this, is the long tail effects of the changes in culture it can have by doing red teaming. It's not so much covering off like a pen test and like go and fix these holes. All you do is perpetuate an iteration style that just goes on forever. Instead, it made real cultural differences, and that's really where the value is. I mean, like why red team? Why invest the time and the money and everything else into doing this? Really, it's a case of, I think by not doing it, it's such a high value activity. I think by not doing it, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're making security a lot harder for you to do. Like you see so many security people talk about building up security champions, finding the people that are already inspired about security in your engineering organization and using them to challenge change and make change happen. What with this, you can make your own security champions. You can make it something that everyone cares about. Everyone is inspired to be more conscious of security going forward by doing these kind of processes. And I think by making it very real and making the development teams handle this as opposed to it being someone else's responsibility is really critical to becoming cloud native. It's not, security is not someone else's responsibility. I mean, we said it 50 slides ago, it's everyone's responsibility. So these things have to be embedded. And I guess I kind of just want to finish on the difference between a novice and a master. And to take chess as the example for this, a novice sees the board in terms of pieces, and a master sees it in forms of chunks and patterns. And that's what allows the master to operate at such a higher level than the novice, is the fact they don't look at the board the same way a novice does. When it comes down to a security incident, would you rather have someone that is piecing it all together for the first time? Or would you rather have someone that has patterns, that has experience next to you, helping you? And that is the end. Thank you very much for attending. We have 10 minutes left if there are questions. More than happy to answer any and all. But if we have no questions, then we can leave it there and you can get 10 minutes back into your day.